Welcome to Cure America. I'm Star Parker. And there is no more overused word in political life today than historic. But considering the runoff races for the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, historic is the right word. There's little remaining in our nation of what we all once thought of as political middle ground. Today, we've got the left, we've got the right, and not much in the center. And with Democrats now controlling the White House possibly and the House of Representatives positively, only a Republican-controlled Senate would stand in the way of what progressive left wings have in mind for our country, what they want to do to it, and what they will be able to do through new laws and public policy. If Republicans do not win at least one of those 2 Georgia Senate races, we should embrace ourselves for the most sweeping left-wing rewrite of our national script ever. Just think about the Equality Act, which President-elect Joe Biden has set as a legislative priority for his first 100 days. The Equality Act pretends to protect rights of LGBTQ individuals. But like all left-wing rhetoric about protecting rights, the Equality Act is an attempt to use political power to force a given agenda on everyone in violation of the rights of those with competing values. This new law would open eradicating any biological basis to define gender and leave it to individuals to define for themselves what sex they want to be, or sometimes just feel compelled to be at any given moment. These then self-defined she-men or he-women and all the combinations known today as transgender would become a legally protected class. This means that it will be against the law for any facility in public spaces to give credence to men and women as direct, distinguished, biologically determined, unique individuals, fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm speaking about mandated same-sex bathrooms and locker rooms in all public spaces, including public schools. Look into it for yourself. The Equality Act has nothing to do with protecting rights. This is about using political power to advance LGBTQ. So I thought we should talk about the fight for control of the U.S. Senate that's going on down in Georgia this week on Cure America. I have a very special guest to weigh in on some critical questions surrounding the makeup of our legislative branches and their impact on the White House. What happens when 3 government bodies have one agenda? You may be wondering why there is so much political tension surrounding the runoff elections in Georgia and whether or not the outcome will directly affect your day-to-day life. So, you'll hear from my panel, a very distinguished panel, to help us sort through the noise of the news to find some truth. So let's dive into these discussions right after this very important message.
Hello, I'm Franklin Graham. Right now, we're in Alaska unloading a hospital for COVID-19. But right now, our country is in trouble, and people are scared, people are afraid, and we see the violence and the injustices that are taking place. Only God can change this. This is a problem of the human heart, and we have sinned against God, and as a nation, we've turned our back on God. And I want you to know that God loves you, He cares for you, and He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, from heaven to this earth to take our sins. And if we'll confess them and repent, turn from them, and believe on His Son, Jesus Christ, God will forgive us and He'll heal our hearts. If you have never invited Christ into your heart, pray this prayer with me right now. Just say, God, I'm a sinner. I'm sorry, forgive me. I believe Jesus Christ is your Son. I want to trust Him as my Savior. I want to follow Him as Lord from this day forward forever. Amen. Call that number right now that's on the screen. We've got someone who will pray with you, talk with you, encourage you. God bless.
My special guest to talk to us about the Senate fate coming down to Georgia is Mr. Zach Smith. He joins us from the Heritage Foundation. You know our friends at Heritage Foundation, and he is a legal fellow there in the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies after serving for years as an assistant United States attorney in the Northern District of Florida. Thank you for joining us in Washington, D.C. from Florida. There's a lot of change for your life for sure, not just the weather.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Well, we really need an expert, someone that has looked at what's going on there in Georgia. And I think more important than what's going on in Georgia and the details of the races, the
Sure.
two Senate races that are taking place, is the significance of the legislative branch. Let's talk about that for a minute for people that might have to dust off their books from civics to say,
Sure.
why are we all involved in Georgia right now?
Well, it really comes down to control of the Senate. And so if Democrats pick up both of the Senate seats in Georgia, they will have control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidency. And so they'll essentially be able to push through pretty much legislation that they favor, even legislation that for many years has been considered very extreme, very radical. And we've already heard some talk about that, things like packing the Supreme Court because they don't like some of the decisions that have come down from the court. Things like making D.C. a state, basically adding additional senators to the Senate. And so it really is very important because Congress, as the branch that most directly responds to we the people, really takes the forefront in passing a lot of legislation, passing a lot of policies. And if there is unified Democratic control of the government, they certainly have a very different view of what they would see the next 2 to 4 years being for our country.
And maybe even ignore half of the we the people, because you're pointing out something of significance, that you have the House of Representatives, you have the Senate that more often than not actually debates what the House has passed, and then it gets
Right.
up to the White House. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in the two branches, if you will. Let's look at the House of Representatives. This is very local to people. They know that they go in to vote for their own congressional leader.
Right.
But now the Senate, it's state, it's two, and it's become very national. It's about
Right.
all of our interests. So could you get into that a little bit for our folks?
Sure. So the House of Representatives is supposed to be the most responsive to the voters. So every member of the House stands for election every 2 years. And there's 435 voting members of the House of Representatives, by far the most numerous branch of the legislature.
And it's active because each one represents, what, 600,000 to 700,000 people.
Approximately.
So that's how we, the people, are engaged, because we have smaller districts and then they come together.
Right.
Okay. So,
And then, the number of representatives per state can vary because it's based on population.
Right.
So larger states, New York, Florida, Texas, California, have far more representatives than smaller states. The Senate, on the other hand, senators serve 6-year terms. There are 2 senators for every state. There's only 100 senators. And so each senator has much more say in the legislative process. They're typically afforded more privileges in terms of things like speech and debate, like you were mentioning. And then also, I'm sure everyone's heard of the filibuster. Senators are entitled to filibuster certain things, right now legislation predominantly. And so a lot of those things, if control of the Senate changes hands, not only could there be changes in terms of the type of legislation we see coming out, but changes to the rules of the Senate itself that would make it much easier for a majority to act.
And I think a lot of people depend on the Senate to be that checks and balances, what I'm hearing you saying. Now, Heritage, as the premier policy institute here in Washington, D.C., you guys weigh in on a variety of areas and issues. There's been a lot of concern coming out of the policy think tanks here in Washington. Explain a little bit about, you talked about 2 things, D.C., you talked about perhaps what happened in the judiciary,
Sure.
but explain a little bit about some of the legislation that maybe the people might not want. I've already talked a little bit about the Equality Act, and we'll get into some of that discussion during our panel, but there are many areas of taxation policy, education policies that people should be very concerned that we would have a check and balance against some of the more extreme, is the word that you use, coming out of or potentially coming out of the House.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. Because, again, if there's unified government, it would essentially give one party the ability to push through their policy goals. And so you hit on many of the key areas. There would be legislation, taxation, certainly different social values than many conservatives will hold would likely be put forward. And so it would really just be a fundamental transformation. It could be of our
guns. I could start thinking about a lot of things. I think the interpretation of the Second Amendment, but you've used the word unified because that makes it sound almost like it's a good idea to have a consistent government. But I think that we've seen where the American people usually don't want that, and this would be new. I think this would be unprecedented.
Well, the unified government, that's happened before, but certainly the types of proposals we're being heard talked about are unprecedented in a lot of ways. You know, the last time someone seriously talked about packing our court system or the Supreme Court was the 1930s with FDR. And even then, his own party came out and said, no, that's too radical. It would undermine the integrity of our judicial branch. We're not going to do it. Unfortunately, today, we don't hear those same types of voices, for the most part, coming out against a lot of these types of proposals. Do
you think that there's a possibility that those voices would come out? Because you'd have to think that everyone in the Democrat Party wouldn't agree with these things either. You have about 30 seconds I'd like for you to see.
Sure. We've certainly seen some senators. Joe Manchin from West Virginia has come out and said he wouldn't support all of these ideas. But again, you know, they've certainly been talked about at length. They're certainly being seriously considered. And Chuck Schumer said that if Democrats take control of the Senate, you know, he certainly intends to put forward many of these proposals to a vote on the floor of the Senate.
Well, we'll be watching very closely, Zach, I tell you, and I'm glad to know that Heritage Foundation is watching very closely. And I think you're heritage.org if people want to find out more information, because it's important that we're an engaged people. I think that most thought that the engagement should stop at us electing these guys. Why isn't that happening? You're here in Washington. Why is it that now there has to be so much watch here in what they're doing?
Well, because quite frankly, there's a lot of legislation being proposed, a lot of proposals that can come out of an administration. And so if a Biden administration comes into office, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, they've already put forward some ideas that they would propose to take. And so it's very important that our representatives in the House and the Senate, they should act as a check against any of those ideas, especially ones that are constitutionally problematic.
Well, we do have a good Supreme Court. I suppose we can look forward to that. And unfortunately, too many more cases will start to go there. We start seeing the progressive left try to push some of these things that are counterculture, frankly, because I don't think a lot of the American people want them. So I want to thank you for joining with us today on Cure America. And we're going to keep our eye on it. I hope that we can see you in the future.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Good. Okay, I'm going to bring my distinguished panel back right after this so that we can get into a little bit more of what does this look like on education policy, what will it look like with this Equality Act, what will it look like with even the taxation they have in mind. I'll be right back. Georgia, especially Hotlanta. Oh my goodness, you wouldn't think that the races would come down to, or the fate of the Senate would come down to Georgia, but it has. And so we're going to continue the discussion with our distinguished panel. I have with me Dr. William Allen. Welcome back. Thank you.
Welcome back to you too.
You had a wonderful Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I did indeed, and I understand you did. You had a quiet one, but one that you enjoyed here in D.C.
I did. It's not my normal to be in Washington during any holiday, but it was fine. And Henry's just getting back too. Henry Olson's coming back, and thank you. Thank you.
Well,
It's good
thanks for having
seeing
me
you.
back, yes.
From the Washington Post, you guys know Henry Olson from the Washington Post, and of course Dr. Allen from CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, and then Jonathan, Alexandra. Hey, I have my all-star distinguished panel this time.
Yeah,
Hi.
thanks so much for having me, Star.
You're welcome.
We're
And
happy
you
to be
even
back.
said happy birthday to me.
I know.
I
Kept
love
in
that.
mind.
Yeah, you're kind of keeping up. Either that or somebody told you, and or they tried to give you leftover cake. Because while all of you were away, they had a party here. Our CURE team had a birthday party for me, a surprise party for lunch, and I already had a lunch scheduled. So that was an interesting move around the calendar. But thank you for
Yeah,
that.
we're all happy.
Yeah, I'm happy too. Kind of getting closer to that magical number where I can go back on welfare. Go back to Medicare and Social Security. Anyway, Jonathan, as you know, is a constitutional attorney with Liberty Counsel, and so I'm glad that they're with us. I'm glad you're with us because it's really, really important. I was praying for a rainy night in Georgia on election night, but unfortunately, like a lot of these elections, they're moving. They have mail-ins. They have time limits. Time unrestrained. So it's really, really complicated. So, Dr. Allen, I want to start with you because it's a critical one. And in fact, on blackcommunitynews.com, you published a column, from Center for Urban Renewal and Education from Carl Jackson, and he asked the question why Raphael Warnock shouldn't be a pastor or a senator. And he goes into it. He says, Black Lives Matter has done more to influence the attitudes of Black Americans than Black Christians have in decades. And we have leaders like Warnock to thank for it. And then he goes into this long litany of things that this candidate is very liberal about.
Very liberal. That's an interesting way of expressing it. When critical race theory invaded our schools and our corporations, it also invaded our churches. Wow. And people like Warnock is just an example, applying within the Black community the same kind of poisons we see at large that have generated discussions about microaggressions and political correctness and intersectionality and all the rest of it. So, yes, of course, he doesn't represent the Black community that you recognize and know, or that I recognize and know. He represents a new force, a postmodern, if I can be academic for a moment, a post-structural force that denies all the old values and, most of all, Christian values.
Well, I'm wondering if enough people know about this. Henry, there is a lot of attention being played on the political part. Tell us a little bit deeper into what we should be concerned about with these two races, two different worldviews, if you will?
Well, it's absolutely essential that the Republicans control the Senate, and that means winning at least one of those two seats. But ultimately, this is a battle of ideas. It's a battle of worldviews. It's a battle of values. And Raphael Warnock is a very smart, very articulate advocate for what he openly calls liberationist theology, which is an adaptation of all of the progressive, postmodern, Marxist views of the world, struck under what he calls the historical suppression of the African American community in the United States. And he views the Bible through that lens. And that gives him a unique danger and a unique power. And it's something that I think you'll be hearing more about as we move into December and actually move into Christmas, which is a providential time to discuss why Jesus came into the world.
Isn't that interesting, especially while we're in Advent at this moment, waiting, watching, and this is one that we have to watch. So, Jonathan, I'm wondering, are enough people watching? Do what Dr. Allen and what Henry Olson just defined about this worldview in this particular candidate? I don't want to single him out, but I'm going to single him out because I think he's the most radical and extreme. Do enough people know this?
Yeah, as well you should. It's worth signaling him out. I mean, he'll be a rubber stamp if he's in the Senate. He'll certainly, if they confirm or they elect two Democrat senators, they'll have the majority with the tiebreak in Kamala Harris. And I don't think enough folks are paying attention. Of course, it was a runoff election. There were 20 candidates on the Republican side, and so there was a lot of bashing even within the Republican Party to see who would emerge as being that candidate. And so he honestly got a free pass. He was able to scathe underneath the radar, and it's just
Did he not have an opponent? It was just him on the Democrat side for this?
Well, there were Democrat opponents, but he was able to scathe without much attack ads going after, the sermons that he preached. But as you're unwrapping and seeing exactly not only the theology that he represents, but all of his influencers, he's never denied his influencers, that he maintains the same sort of worldview that is this communistic worldview, even references to Fidel Castro in his past where he's shared the stage with him. So this is a man that has flown under the radar, and as he's poking his head up during these last few weeks of the election, I think it is time for folks to really realize just how radical of an influence he will have, not only rubber stamping the president's agenda, but also bringing forth this socialist agenda that the Democrat Party has been known for.
The people keep mentioning the socialist agenda. We saw it and we heard about it through the last year. Henry, you mentioned how the Republicans must win. I'm wondering, are there enough Americans that are saying why? We don't see a problem. Why is it that, as much as it's being mentioned that this is inconsistent, these values of socialism, communism, Marxism are inconsistent with American values, that half the country still voted for the left?
Well, they voted for somebody who is not in his heart a socialist. They voted for somebody who is a heir to the FDR New Deal tradition, which itself has its difficulties and problems, but is not the same thing as socialism. I think that if they make a good case, that they can make enough people in Georgia recognize that they can deny Warnock the win, but they have to make a good case, and that's something that they're trying to do, and we'll see whether they're able to do it.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Allen?
Well, I'm looking at this from a different perspective. I'm remembering what happened 4 years ago with Andrew Gillum. Was his first name Andrew? Gillum.
I believe so, yeah.
In Florida. He nearly became governor, even though he had serious flaws that didn't come to light until after the campaign, interestingly enough. With Warnock, you're going to see something similar, it seems to me. He has all these problems we've identified and other people are identifying, but the question is going to become, will the general public see it in that light? Or will it only emerge afterwards? So I think he is posed and positioned the way Gillum was positioned.
But I think there's a big difference, though, that Gillum, for one, had an opposition candidate who is now the sitting governor of Florida, who was adamant and focused on what he believed. And in that state, he ran on issues that mattered to the people of Florida. He ran on school choice and school options, and it was a local government. So I want you to think with me about this being Senate and them not getting as involved in local matters and local issues.
Well, see, that's why you're underscoring what I'm saying. Gillum almost got through, but was checked by the emphasis on school choice. But here you don't really have any outstanding tensions at that level
that's what
in
I'm
the
wondering
campaign.
about. That's why
so
I'm
it's
a little...
only his character, his personality, that seems to be the distinguishing factor, and whether that will surface, that's the issue.
Is it the only thing that matters? I mean, I think that the left is saying that the candidate he's running against, Loeffler, has a few problems herself. In fact, we saw in the national news right before COVID that she short-sold some stock or something. Henry, are you?
Well, that's what she, they never found that she did. She always said it was her neutral investment advisor who made those decisions. That's never been disproven.
Well, how do you do that in a 30-second ad? But go ahead. how do you say no?
I was going to say it hasn't stopped Warnock from making the claim. But look, it's not his character that's at issue. What's at issue is his worldview. He views the United States as a fallen, fundamentally corrupt, racist nation. And the question is, can you make that point in an effective way in modern campaigning that says, look, if the apple does not fall far from his tree, the man that he eulogized 2 years ago was a man who viewed you, the average Georgian, as a class and race oppressor.
Right.
How can you elect a man whose intellectual idol, whose intellectual heir is somebody who views you as a tyrant and a slave master? That's the point that has to be made, and it can be made, but they have to want to make it.
But to what part of the population? Jonathan, the state is 44% ethnic, and these messages have been attempted to go into the minority communities forever, and it just keeps seeming that there's just not that much attention played on, wait a minute, guys, this is not consistent with your biblical worldview. This is not who we should be. When you start thinking about his associations, from Abrams to all of them, all of the black elite now, adopt these ideas of Castro, all of the entertainers. I don't know that I'm as confident that we can break into this particular race with truth.
I think you're right. And the error in having such a nationalized Georgia race, the entire Democrat apparatus, the entire Republican apparatus is focused on Georgia. And so you have the interests of a country and not necessarily Georgians when it comes to the specific election. But there is a trend in Georgia. It's an unfortunate trend. Georgia was a solid red state during the Romney vote, a solid red state, of course, in Bush. And the numbers got narrower and narrower as Trump won, and even Stacey Abrams, when she was running for governor, she had it was a very narrow loss. In fact, she still claims that she won. So if we look at Georgia, it's certainly becoming more of a purple state. But as you mentioned, the African American groups in there, groups that have solid conservative values, Gwinnett County, individuals that have had generations there that have held on to biblical principles, for some reason are voting in a way that isn't consistent with their faith, voting in a way that makes the nationalized standard of this vote in this Senate race. It's the national influence that seems to be impacting them more, and not necessarily those local home values that you'd hope would be the influence for their vote.
Or even for a national, because we would want them to be national values, because they will be if they control. If the left controls the Senate, which they will if the Democrats run it, because we see that that's where things are going, then it will. So I'm wondering, just to even what you said, how much is ethnicity involved in this as opposed to the values? Because when you speak, Henry, you're talking about the America that many know. You mentioned Trump. But when they speak, they're talking about an unknown America to a ethnic population. Am I making sense of what I'm trying to ask? And so I'm just wondering how many are going to set aside their color and vote for their Christianity.
And that's the hope. And I think if there are efforts that can be made in the next 2 weeks, it's, what groups are doing, handing out pamphlets that just demonstrate this is what the Republican Party stands for, this is what the Democrat Party has stood for on these core conservative issues, and not really being swayed by what the media is saying, how they're characterizing the two candidates, but looking at the platform. The difficulties in this following up a national election for a general election for president, and the debates that are still going on whether or not that election is finalized, is that that's where all the air is. All the air has been taken out of the room in terms of policy issues, and it's being dealt with almost exclusively as this general election, and not really focusing on what should be close to home in terms of Georgians voting.
Dr. Allen, I want to hear from you, because how is it that black Christians are getting lost in what was pointed out in the column that you posted on blackcommunitynews.com through Urban Cure? Black Lives Matters has been done more to influence the attitude of Black America. How did we get here, and how do we get out? And you're going to have to answer that on the other side, I suppose. Wait, no, you have about 30 seconds.
I have 30 seconds to say that you aren't going to solve the problem of race in politics with an appeal to race. And the problem between blacks who are responding to racial campaigns, as even the national campaign was, and Black Lives Matter, is that will separate them from their fundamental faith.
Okay, wait, so what you're saying is that, back up, because I want to make sure I understood what you're saying. So on a national, you're saying that even for the Republicans to focus on the racial aspect, we've already put ourselves in the losing seat.
You're reinforcing the losing argument.
Wow, because what we should be thinking about, we'll have to talk about on the other side of the break, is the clarity of who America is.
Yes.
Wow, okay, we're gonna hear more about that. And then the community impact, what can you do, what should we do, and what we should be thinking about to do after this break.
Today, a student in public school will pray or lead a Bible study. Today, a pastor will preach boldly the truth of the Scriptures without fear of the IRS. Today, the life of an innocent child will be saved, and a mother will experience the joy of a newborn baby. A distraught woman will find hope and choose life rather than death. Today, there is a strong voice defending God's created natural order of marriage and family. There is a defender of freedom in the courtroom and in the halls of Congress and in legislative bodies across the land. Today, all of this is possible because of the ministry of Liberty Counsel. People from all over America will find help and hope because of Liberty Counsel. The adversity they face will be turned into victory. Case by case, law by law, person by person, Liberty Counsel is advancing religious freedom, the sanctity of human life, and the family through litigation, education, and public policy. And that is the mission of Liberty Counsel. to restore the culture by advancing life, liberty, and family.
Right on the other side of the break, Dr. Allen was talking to us about that critical race theory, and I want to hear more because it is just a theory, and I think that it hurts us to keep bringing things just to race because it distorts reality. What were you telling us?
Part of what I was trying to say is that if we respond to campaigns that have been predicated on race with reinforcing racial arguments, we're actually strengthening the campaign based on race to begin with. And that's a losing proposition. I know my friend Henry thinks that there's a good chance for the Republicans to take this race in Georgia. And I say to him, it looks more to me like Charlie Brown kicking the football. Mm-hmm. And they're going to meet the same campaign structure, the same appeals, and they don't have an answer to it. Mm-hmm. And so trying to frame that answer in racial terms is a big mistake as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I agree. And Henry, would you agree? Because when you think about just racism, socialism, is that going to win a national race that's so critical to all of us today?
I think that over the long term, the Republican Party needs to be able to explain what it means to be an American. Mm-hmm. It's not something that people are going to come up with in a 2-week time and stick it in a 30-second ad. Right. I do think that there's enough of a Republican base in Georgia that it is going to be a very tight race, and the people that both sides need, particularly Raphael Warnock, is he needs the votes of affluent white suburbanites who voted for Mitt Romney and voted for Joe Biden. And what the Loeffler campaign should be doing is saying, this is a man who calls your way of life white capitalist oppression, which he does. Okay. This is a man who thinks that the Bible is one of black liberation theology from you, the white capitalist. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how many people driving BMWs and going and getting their hair done and ferrying their kids about think of themselves as racist, capitalist oppressors. If you can make that point, and you can in a 30-second ad, right, then I think you can break through. But if they're not willing to do it or they don't do it inartfully, this will just be another coin flip election that depends on how you energize your already converted people to come out and cast your ballots.
Well, let's hope it doesn't amount to that, because this one is historic and critical for all of us, and to have to look at Georgia. And so my question, you talked about the specifics of what the campaign should be doing, and I pray they do, because I think you're absolutely right there, Henry. But Jonathan, other specifics are of concern too. If the Republicans don't pull this out, and we have Democrats in control of both of our houses in the Congress, and then we have control of the White House. If that is the reality, there are some specifics in culture, in taxing, in education that we need to address, I would think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You think of what Biden has put on the table as what he'll do in the first 100 days, something like the Equality Act, this radical reshifting of everything we know in terms of public interaction. And it sounds innocuous, right? The Equality Act. Everyone should be for equality. But what this bill actually does, and it's already passed this previous session in 2019, it places sexual orientation
in the House.
In the House.
The Senate was the stopgate.
Exactly.
And now if the Senate goes Democrat, it can pass.
It'll be rubber
in the House and then in the, go ahead.
Right, it'll be rubber stamped and pushed through, and Biden says he wants to do this. So he needs a Senate that allows for sexual orientation and gender identity to become part of civil rights law. And what that will do is take the full force of the federal government and using it as an agent to promulgate and to push LGBT agenda. And anything that stands in its way, whether it's the church, whether it's religious objection, whether it's moral conscience objection, whether it's even doctors who don't want to perform transgender surgeries, that will be steamrolled over as they put and implement, using the force of federal government, this Equality Act. That's just one of the many things that are at stake. But I think, as Joe Biden mentioned, that's one of his top priorities and something that the Senate needs to be a strong bulwark against.
Well, I hope the Christians are hearing you on that one. And that's not the only concern, Henry. We're thinking about his tax plans and what he has in store for not just, as they say, the wealthy, but this could hit the middle class and business community after we're just now trying to recover from COVID.
Well, definitely it'll hit the business community. Look, the one thing that they can pass on a majority vote is a tax bill. That's because of a thing called budget reconciliation. That's how Republicans have passed tax cuts and bypassed the filibuster. That's how they'll do their tax increases. Biden wants to increase taxes on individuals. He wants to repeal the corporate tax cuts, including on small business. And there's no way they can pay for their spending programs and do anything to keep the deficit marginally acceptably high as opposed to skyrocketing without beginning to tax the middle class and the upper middle class more. All those people who sit in those affluent Atlanta suburbs will see either their businesses socked with tax cuts themselves, tax hikes, themselves socked with tax hikes, or both if they give the Democrats control of the Senate.
Yikes. And other things too, Dr. Allen. It's like this is coming down to a whole lot of unraveling of what we've come to know as American culture. And when we talk about prosperity and what really brings value, economic value, moral value, but also when you just talk about a way of life for parents and their children, what is going to happen there when the federal government is controlled by people that have no interest in local, small, and unique government?
Yeah. But when you're thinking about the choices people have to make in their lives, the main point to underscore is they're going to have diminished opportunity to choose. They're going to have diminished opportunity to choose with regard to taxation and therefore economic performance, diminished opportunity to choose with regard to the civil rights questions that have been posed and discussed, and diminished opportunity to choose schooling for their children, to choose their educational outcomes. It is simply going to be a greater presence of the government in the lives of the people of this country, diminishing their choices across the board, because that's what the agenda is.
You know, we say this, and I've heard this from conservatives, and we hear about it on a regular basis in the news to some extent, but yet half the country still voted for this left-wing agenda. They voted for it. It's no need of us pretending that it's some other matter, unless it is some other matter. What happened? Why is it that although we're understanding some of the destruction that will take place from this Equality Act, from what they'll do in taxes, from what they'll do in all of the programming that they have, including with education and more limited choices, do people just not care? What should we be thinking about and doing in our local communities to make them care if they don't?
Well, certainly people have to continue to express the kinds of sentiments that you saw actually visible in this election. Look down ballot and you don't see people voting for this progressive agenda. What you see is people constrained in a political environment where the effect of their participation didn't really reflect their opinions. There's a division between the outcome of the election and the opinions of the voters. Apart from the manufactured votes, in which I still believe, basic citizens to a huge degree reflected a steadiness and a conservatism that is still important.
Do you agree with that, Henry?
Well, it depends on what we mean by conservatism. You know, look, the United States has wanted a large government since at least the election of 1932. They want to have government involved in a way to remove some of the risks and moderate some of the downsides of the pre-New Deal world. And that's not going to go away. But what they don't want is a government that calls all the shots, that tells them what to do with their lives, and constrains them into being simple cogs in a machine. And they're continually faced in their minds with a choice between one side that wants to make them cogs in the machine and another side that doesn't understand that they want to have some degree of stability that government can provide. And once a conservatism responds to that and actually says there is a role in a conservative government for providing affirmative health for people who genuinely need it. It's not all on your own. It's not pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
I see that I've not heard that from conservatives that it's all or nothing. I hear a lot from libertarians, but we're talking about conservatives who pass things like faith-based initiatives and continue to support Social Security and Medicare. So I don't take it that far that is an extreme of conservative, but it is of libertarian. We do know that they want as small a government as possible. But my question then would be, based on what Henry said, Jonathan, are people willing to take less government, and even if it means not having a whole lot of the benefit that they think that they're getting, or are they going to buy this idea that because we want benefits since the 30s, we're going to allow government to get into areas of our lives to undermine the very values that we say we believe.
Right, and I think that's a difficulty of the exchange, the social contract that was sort of the basis for any established nation, but really the basis of our country. I think that contract is very one-sided now, and it's leaning towards government, where government has spread their tentacles into areas of life that they should never be involved in. And of course, we do have to harp back on the moral implications of what's going on. You have, even in this Equality Act that we mentioned, you have a carve-out for discrimination against pregnancy, and they throw that word in sort of, innocuously. You don't really know what it means, but it effectively means that the federal government now cannot disallow an individual from getting an abortion from the legislative side. Of course, we already have that in the federal courts through Roe v. Wade, but now the legislature is codifying this, which means tax dollars follow it. And that's the same application.
So we're all going to be paying for abortion.
Exactly, and that's in the language. You wouldn't pay attention to it if it's not called out to you. And there's so many different areas, almost 120 statutes within the federal agencies, of which there are far too many federal agencies.
Well, and that's what I think has happened. We'll get into Henry's point that people want some government role in helping others, which, we can debate another time how aggressive that should be, especially from a federal standpoint. I think that the feds should leave it to the states and local communities. But the devil in the details is a true statement, Dr. Allen. There's a lot of devil in a lot of these details, and I don't know that people are paying close enough attention to know how it's going to impact their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think that's true. The devil is in the details. I think what Henry was suggesting before is a true fact. People want smart government. What we need to understand, however, is that smart government is government that enables people to take care of themselves and doesn't displace people in taking care of themselves.
So the American people don't understand this, or is it politicians?
The politicians certainly don't, because they're constantly trying to take over the tasks that people should be performing for themselves. Smart government enables people to look after themselves. That's what smart government does. That's what people want, conservative, center, and even somewhat to the left.
I don't know, Henry, is that what you were saying? Because, and I'm not sure, because I think Americans want more than smart government. They do want security from government. They want to make sure that if something happens to me, Uncle Sam's there.
Well, but the sort of things they want is sort of things that allow them to exert some control over their circumstances.
Precisely.
Which includes things like subsidies with public education, because most people couldn't afford to send all of their children to a decent quality school without some degree of taxation, whether it's called a public school or whether it's a school voucher. But within that thing that government does provide, they want to be able to direct themselves and take care of themselves. And that's the balance that I think would be better met by a vocal, aggressive conservatism that recognizes that, rather than one that is always pushing in a way that runs against the grain of American sentiment for the last 90 years.
That's interesting, because there again, at the conservative, I've been in this town since welfare reform, and I just feel that the difference is not that they don't acknowledge this, they just don't want it done from Washington. Am I missing something?
I think you're right. Local control has always been the bedrock of American society. One thing that has been diluted, especially in the Georgia race, with it being nationalized, and everything leading up to even the general election, is that the issues weren't really being discussed. We weren't drilling down to anything, honestly, past coronavirus, and maybe healthcare was on the ballot. Folks understood how, in a world of a pandemic, how government healthcare may have some influence. Certainly, there was some talk about education, but it wasn't widespread. The issues that face Americans, Dr. Allen said, on a day-to-day basis weren't being discussed. Both parties.
Whose role is it? That's where I am going to give to Henry, because I think that where conservatives may have missed a little bit is that whose role is it? Not that they don't care about these issues and we're not talking about them. I think that we're talking at each other when it comes to it. Democrats want it done from Washington, and conservatives have not made the case that these things should not be done from Washington. A nanny state is not a good idea for the future of the country. That's where I think about it, Dr. Allen.
It seems reasonable, but remember this. States' rights were once the defense of local reservation, local preserves, local authority, in defense of what was indefensible.
That's right, that's right.
And so we now see state rights on the other side.
I know, and that's
depending
something
the progressive agenda.
I think that's God. God just makes us keep going around until we get it right. So we're going to talk to a pastor next.
Hello, I'm Franklin Graham. Right now, we're in Alaska unloading a hospital for COVID-19. But right now, our country is in trouble, and people are scared, people are afraid, and we see the violence and the injustices that are taking place. Only God can change this. This is a problem of the human heart, and we have sinned against God, and as a nation, we've turned our back on God. And I want you to know that God loves you, He cares for you, and He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, from heaven to this earth to take our sins. And if we'll confess them and repent, turn from them, and believe on His Son, Jesus Christ, God will forgive us and He'll heal our hearts. If you've never invited Christ into your heart, pray this prayer with me right now. Just say, God, I'm a sinner. I'm sorry, forgive me. I believe Jesus Christ is your Son. I want to trust Him as my Savior. I want to follow Him as Lord from this day forward forever. Amen. Call that number right now that's on the screen. We've got someone who'll pray with you, talk with you, encourage you. God bless.
We need a pastor about now, because we've heard a whole lot about what's happening in Georgia, and now Georgia's on all of our minds. This is really incredible. We all know people in Georgia. All of us are pulling out our list of people we know in Georgia and making sure that we're engaged in what's going on. So I have with us Pastor Tim Lateef. Reverend Lateef, as you know, is also a part of CURE. He actually heads up our clergy center. Thank you. The director of the clergy center at the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, but also a pastor. So we need that heart, because when we think about what's at stake, it can become very fearful, you know, and especially if the Democrats win. I hate to be so partisan, but that's what's going on now. It's broken down to we're Republicans or Democrat. And if Democrats win, they have things in store that we've been hearing about and talking about that can be very, very detrimental to our futures. That Equality Act, what's going to happen in taxes, what's going to happen in culture and our very way of living when it comes to how we educate our children. As Dr. Allen pointed out, just the decisions we get to make, our own choices. So what are you thinking about, and what is the Lord telling you to think about or showing you that you should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I love how you led with engage. That's a part of what we do with the Clergy Network. Educate, equip, and engage. A lot of people are not voting the way they should, or living the way they should, or living out their values because they're not educated. Okay. They're missing that component, and that's a part of what we do with CURE.
So when you say that, though, they don't know any better? I don't understand how it is that some know and some don't. When you just turn on the news, you can kind of hear a little bit.
Well, it's a lack of information. I mean, think about the show that we have right now. How many shows like this are going into the communities that we serve, that we work with? There's a lack of information. And so a lot of times we want individuals to engage, but they don't have that education in the beginning. And then we can't get them to be equipped because they don't feel that they're ready to move in that direction.
Is there more that the pastor then should be doing from the pulpit? You know, I know that there have been expressed concerns about Johnson Amendment, and I don't want to rock any boats in my congregation. Are clergy missing an opportunity to weigh in on culture? I mean, my goodness, the scripture was clear about what we should do on behalf of the biblical principles that we all adhere
to use your words, you should rock the boat. James makes it clear. He says, dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity. This is an opportunity for the church to stand, for individuals to be bold in their faith. This is not an opportunity to cower away from that. So yeah, that's what the church is all about, right? The church went through persecution as well. So why should we shy away from troubles? Why should we shy away from tribulation? Why should we shy away from challenging times?
But that's my question to you. Why do the pastors shy away?
I don't think all do.
Well, not all,
I don't think all do.
They keep voting for people that are inconsistent with values, especially when we think about our poorer communities, those that represent our poorer communities. You know, we keep hearing so much about critical race theory. We are so stuck in issues of race and racism that it seems like the black community can't even move forward to even be consistent.
Yeah, well, I think it's an issue.
This man is a pastor that we're talking about that's running now for the Senate, that I can't find anything that's consistent with the Bible that I read.
Well, I think that it's an issue of picking culture over kingdom. You have to make a decision to say, I'm going to live for biblical values and biblical principles. A lot of the individuals that are choosing to follow these individuals, I believe in their hearts are conflicted, but they're fearful to be able to stand up and say, you know what, I don't want to go that way, or I don't want to do that. And so that's why it's important for shows like this and the work that we do to say, it's okay to stand up. It's okay to be bold. And here's the other point.
Wait. Okay. I want to hear your other point. But
Yeah.
you're telling me pastors are afraid to get up in the pulpit and tell the truth. Is that what I'm hearing?
I believe that there are pastors that are afraid. They're afraid of what the backlash will look like. They're
they need to
afraid
leave the
to
pulpit.
they're
Go ahead,
afraid
what's
to
your-
stand up. But here's the second point to this.
Yeah, because I
The
need to hear
second
another point. Because for a pastor to be afraid, if he's not even going to share the truth, then what is he doing with flock? What is he telling his people?
It's
We'll
not
talk about
good. It's
that
not good.
another time.
But here's this.
upset
But
me
here's
now.
this. Here's
Yeah,
this. Here's
okay.
this. Here's the other point. The other point comes when we look in the book of Acts, right? So if you look at the Apostle Paul, so we talk about the persecuted church,
Yeah.
right? But then you talk about one that actually persecuted the church. So at that time, he's Saul. So he goes from Paul to Saul, or Saul to Paul.
Saul to Paul.
But he makes a decision at that point when God makes a decision to say, I'm going to impact your life and change your heart. And so God has the ability to do that. So I don't think we have to have this position that, oh no, individuals are doing what they want to do and the country can't turn around or the church should not be, but whatever it may be, the bottom line is that God is powerful.
Right.
The bottom line is there is a remnant and there'll be more that arise, but he also can change the hearts of
He can
individuals.
still change the hearts. I love that. Okay, you've encouraged me again, because what I'm hearing now is he can move beyond that pastor, even give a revelation to that pastor, because what happened to Saul was a miracle. And I think that people don't believe in miracles anymore. Maybe these pastors who won't even tell the truth don't believe in miracles anymore, because God did confront him on the way to Damascus. He was going to
Damascus
kill
Road
Christians.
experience. That's it.
So is that for today? Can we rise up to that occasion or lower ourselves to that occasion? I mean, we are in Advent. We are waiting for his coming. Can we not pray it away, but in action, in activity? Is there something we can do?
Yeah, first of all, it can happen. It happened in your life. I mean,
Well,
you're a
that's-
living testimony,
well, that's
example of
true.
an individual
I keep
that can
reminding
say,
myself, yes, and he can save
and if
others,
he can
too.
do it for you,
Yeah.
then he can do it for others.
And I agree.
so the bottom line is that that's why the work we do is so important,
You're right.
because there are pastors out there who's going to listen to this and say, hey, I want to stand and I'm going to continue to stand, and others will do it. But we can't have a position that doesn't have hope. We have to have a position that says God is in control.
He is.
And here's the deal.
Yes.
God can use an army, but he never needed a large one.
That
And
is
so
true,
he
too.
will use who he needs to get his work accomplished.
I agree with you, Pastor. And I think that in this particular situation, while we will still war for biblical truth on the other side, if necessary, if the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. But I think right now I'm wondering, do they have to? You know, can we stop it? It kind of reminds me of the lyrics of that song. It's good to know he'll be there when we fall,
Yeah.
but it's better to know we don't have to fall. We don't have to lose these races down there in Georgia, do we?
Yeah, well, let me finish the rest of this verse, because
Yeah.
it says, for you know that when your faith is tested, meaning these tribulations come, all of a sudden something is produced in you that you didn't know was inside of you. So could it be that some of the individuals that weren't bold enough before begin to see a turn that is so big and so large in front of their face that resiliency builds up in them?
Wow.
That something allows them to all of a sudden a light bulb goes off that says, maybe I need to speak up, because I haven't been feeling good about this anyway. My spirit has been conflicted, but I haven't had the boldness to speak out on it.
That's a good place for us to pray then, that not only that happens in the clergy, so they'll get up in the pulpit and say, guys, this is not usual times. This is historic, and we need to go and protect the church, rise up, like you said, the little armies that we need to be, but maybe in the hearts of the voters too, that
No
they
doubt
can
about
say, you know what, there's something really wrong here. Gosh, you've encouraged me. This is
No
good.
doubt
Did you
about
say
it.
anything
Good.
else there, Jay?
We'll save it for next time.
We'll save it next time. Well, we have a few more minutes, but I think that, Pastor, one of the things that I do want you to, since I do have about 30 seconds,
Sure.
those clergy that want to be a part of your network, at the network at Urban Cure, what do they need to do?
They need to go to urbancure.org, click on our clergy tab. There's information not only about how to join, but there's also information about what we do, past summits, other pastors around the country that they may know that have been a part of our summits before. They may see some faces and say, man, I've seen that guy before. I've seen him around before. I didn't know he thought this way or believed this way. So it's out there.
It's out there. And it sounds like Tim is building an army. Reverend Lateef, and I'm going to come back with some final thoughts. topics are just so heavy, but we have to report on the news. We have to be engaged. That's what the country is about. But I was so encouraged that a pastor in the end just tells us, okay, let's keep our faith here. And for sure, I will receive threats and hate mail from those who allegedly care about freedom because they think freedom means advancing their values at the expense of mine. But if you have just heard, sex and gender debates are far from the only area where the Biden left is totally detached from what once was known as reality. As the nation swims in red ink with a mind-boggling $3 trillion deficit this year and national debt equal to the size of our entire economy, Biden's economic team thinks government should do more, have more spending, much more, financed by trillions of debt that we will bequeath to our children and our grandchildren. The left's detachment from reality is so sad because America has a long track record showing that it is freedom and limited government that maximizes economic growth and opportunity. There's also a growing track record of high approval in our nation's poor communities by parents wanting to choose the school where their children learn. But the left-wing crowd now in political power over our national affairs is hostile to the idea of education dollars following children to the schools a parent may want, including this new economist who will take over as the head of the Council of Economic Advisors for the president. For sure, hundreds of millions will be spent in Georgia over this next month. And yes, tensions and actions on both sides of the political spectrum are running very high because the stakes are high. And yes, much prayer and action are needed in Georgia right now for every one of us with a biblical worldview who are thinking about our future and the moral inheritance that we're leaving for our grandchildren. Yeah, because yes, while the economic state of our country is of much concern with progressives in charge of our nation's bank accounts and our credit cards, and yes, we'll need to look outside of Washington for poor students to get any kind of equity in education. But the paradigm shift in our nation's moral culture that will take place if that Equality Act is signed into law, it will keep us all up at night, reading through the long history of the persecuted church since they were first called Christians. That's it this week on Cure America with Star Parker. I hope you'll join me again next week. I hope you'll call all of your friends and everybody you know, family in Georgia. Until then, and may the peace of the Lord be with you through this Advent season and today. Thanks for watching Cure America with Star Parker, and I hope that you will continue to think with me every week as we dive into national issues of culture, race, and poverty that are in the headlines. Cure America with Star Parker is made possible by the generosity of our Cure family of friends that contribute to our nonprofit umbrella organization, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, which is a policy institute based here in Washington, D.C. We're a 501c3, tax-exempt organization, so we welcome you to join us, join our family of friends, join our sponsors to help us expand our policy, media, and clergy programs to reach more folks to fight poverty and to restore dignity through messages of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. I hope you also write me. Send me a note if you want to share your thoughts or any ideas. Now, may our good Lord bless you and keep you. May His light shine upon your life and upon the life of all those you love.